On this day in 1926, Britain was heading rapidly towards the general strike. It all started with the miners. The coal mines had come under government control during World War I, but in 1921 they'd been returned to private ownership. As trade conditions became worse, coal owners demanded lower wages and longer hours for the miners. The miners' leader, A.J. Cook, countered with, "Not a minute on the day, not a penny off the pay." So the pits became idle. A state of emergency was proclaimed by the government. Naval ratings were drafted to the mines to ensure that the country got some coal supplies. It was perhaps lucky that in those days so many ships were still coal burning, though a stoker's job was scarcely training for work at the coalface. In spite of all the emergency measures, coal became a very precious commodity, and people went to great lengths to obtain it. Home consumption was regulated and exports prohibited. Never before or after 1926 has coal been transported by such infinitely varied means. Anything on wheels that would carry a sack of coal was used. And to find a piece of coal was almost like finding a gold nugget. The miners themselves and their families suffered from the lack of coal too. And as they filled sacks from their own mines, it was as well they couldn't know that the strike was to last 7 months, and that in the end their protests would have been in vain, and that they would return to the pits defeated. But out on strike or not, and grim though those days were for them, the miners had some carefree moments. And if it was fun for them to be jockeys for an afternoon, it must have been a nice change for the pit ponies to play the part of racehorses. The stakes were modest in this race, and the prize money very small, but it was an afternoon sport. Into the sport of boxing, the famous Jack Dempsey brought more money than any fighter ever has. He drew around £5 million for his promoter Tex Rickard and earned himself the best part of £1 million during the 8 years he was world heavyweight champion. On this day in 1922, Dempsey was in England. He'd been champion for 3 years. Another star of the 20s was Betty Balfour, the famous movie actress. Well, this looks like just another crazy publicity stunt of those days. But on this day in 1929, Betty Balfour is choosing a bodyguard for her latest film, The Vagabond Queen, and it has to be a bow-legged bodyguard. Betty Balfour had inspected about 500 bow-legged men before she found the 25 which was her quota. This day in 1924 was the eve of the opening of the British Empire exhibition at Wembley by King George V and Queen Mary. 200,000 people, 11 cabinet ministers, and nearly 50 members of British and foreign royal families attended the opening. Wembley was the greatest exhibition Britain had ever seen. For 1 6pence, you had 15 miles of sightseeing ahead of you. In his opening address, the King said, "We hope that the success of the exhibition may bring lasting benefit not to the Empire only, but to mankind in general." A few minutes later, King George was handed a telegram announcing the opening that had gone round the world. After his tour around Wembley, the King summed up his impressions by saying he had seen the whole empire in little. Another country and another king. And by this day in 1931, King Alphonso of Spain was king no more. He had abdicated, and he and his British-born Queen Ina had left the country never to return. King Alphonso had had a long reign of 45 years. He'd succeeded to the throne at his birth in 1886, and during the last few years of his reign, unrest had grown. In December 1930, revolution had broken out in the army. Major Franco led a Republican revolt near Madrid. The Republicans incited strikes. The Spanish general elections were due to be held in February 1931. King Alphonso unwisely took high-handed action. He signed a decree cancelling the elections. The same day, the government resigned. 4 days later, Alphonso formed a monarchist cabinet. Elections were finally held on April the 12th, and the vote was strongly Republican. 2 days later, Alphonso abdicated, and Spain was declared a republic. King Alphonso arrived in France. After his abdication, he left Madrid for the naval port of Cartagena, where he embarked on a battleship. He was one of the first of a long succession of ex-kings. Another country which found what it believed to be the solution to its political problems was Eire. For just a week on this day in 1949, Eire had been a republic, and her first president, Sean O'Kelly, joined a dense crowd in Dublin's O'Connell Street as the new Tricolour of Eire was hoisted on the GPO building. The GPO building was the headquarters of the Sinn Féin rebellion of 1916, and it was 33 years later, to the day, that Eire officially became an independent republic and cut her last link with Britain 408 years after Henry VIII was crowned King of Ireland. Ireland, the island of unrest. And unrest is a state of affairs shared by most South American countries. The assassin of a Colombian party leader was lynched by the crowd and his body dragged through the streets of the capital, Bogota, to be left in front of the president's palace. Bogota was in the throes of revolution, of anarchy, as mobs swept through the streets armed with guns and machetes on this day in 1948. For 2 days, the people of Bogota wrecked their own city in an orgy of destruction. 500 were killed, water supplies were contaminated, the city had no light or power. Finally, a new coalition government quelled the riots. It blamed communists for starting them and broke off relations with the Soviet Union to back this theory up. And now an event that may not have been of exactly world significance, but was all the same the cause for plenty of excitement. Sweets off the ration at last, and the sweet shops stocked up for the great rush. A whole generation of children who'd never known the joys of shopping by themselves for their own choice of a pennyworth of bullseyes or a ha'porth of all sorts lined up on the great day. Prices had changed a bit from the old days, but at least one could have freedom of choice without mother making calculations with the coupons. And even the grown-ups could admit to a sweet tooth without that guilty feeling that they should have given their ration to the kids. It was rather like the end of Prohibition in America, only the result next day was not a nationwide hangover, but a national tummy ache. This is the German island of Heligoland, the Gibraltar of the North Sea. Once a British possession, Heligoland was the key point of Germany's sea power. In World War II, it was Hitler's base for the Battle of the Atlantic. On this day in 1947, U-boat pens, gun emplacements and underground storage tunnels were due to be fired by submarine cables and wireless transmission from the Navy's ships 9 miles away. Lieutenant Commander Frank Graves of London pushed the button. 7,000 tons of bombs, depth charges and high explosives detonated inside the island. A 12,000-foot high column of smoke goes up. Submarine pens, coast batteries, and 8.5 miles of underground tunnels were blown sky high. It was the biggest man-made explosion since the atom bomb went off at Bikini. We've learned not to be too sure of anything, but it does seem unlikely that Heligoland will ever again become a war base. And in April 1945, a great personality of our time, Dr. Geoffrey Fisher, was enthroned as Archbishop of Canterbury and Primate of all England. With these pictures, the cinema made history, recording for the first time this ancient ceremony. After the Archbishop is enthroned, the Archdeacon of Canterbury leads Dr. Fisher by the hand to the archiepiscopal throne. This ceremony is repeated in the Dean's stall, and then a procession is formed. Accompanied by the bishops, the Archbishop is led to the chair of St. Augustine. For the third time he is enthroned before all the people assembled in the nave.
Mandate, I, Hewlett Johnson, Doctor of Divinity, Bachelor of Science, Dean of Canterbury, do hereby induct, install, and enthrone you, Most Reverend Father in God, Geoffrey, by divine providence, Archbishop of Canterbury, into the Archbishopric and office of Archbishop of Canterbury.
And then the new Archbishop of Canterbury gives his blessing.
And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be amongst you and remain with you always.